There's a version of me from years ago, sitting at a desk with a paper journal, pen in hand, scribbling thoughts I'd never find again. It felt honest, grounded even. But somewhere between the act of writing and the act of thinking, something got lost. Ideas would stack up on pages with no real relationship to each other. A goal jotted down on a Tuesday had no idea it was connected to a fear I'd written about the following Friday. The journal was full. My mind felt scattered. That's when I started mind mapping. In simple terms, a mind map is a visual tool, software that lets you write your thoughts and branch them outward in any direction, organizing them into categories, hierarchies, flows, or just free-form clouds of ideas. But describing it that way almost undersells it, because what a mind map actually does isn't organize your thoughts, it shows you how your thoughts are already organized, whether you're aware of it or not. I've been using Xmind for several years now. It's available on Mac and PC, and it has a simplicity to it that a lot of the browser-based tools I'd experimented with just couldn't match. The interface gets out of the way and lets you think. As a writer, I use it for far more than brainstorming. I keep lists of things I'm grateful for, not as a performance of positivity, but as a way to take inventory of what actually matters to me. I track goals, recurring thoughts, things I want to revisit, things I want to let go of. It's become something closer to a living record of my inner life than any journal I ever kept on paper. Medium pause. What I couldn't do with paper was search it. That might sound like a small thing, but it changed everything. I can type a single word in Xmind and be taken directly to every corner of my mind map that references it. A goal I set 2 years ago suddenly connects to an idea I had last week. A fear I once named becomes part of a pattern I can actually see. The map becomes a place where past and future coexist, and that's a rare thing. Most tools force you to be either archival or forward-looking. A mind map doesn't ask you to choose. Long pause. If you've never tried it, starting small is the move. Even 5 minutes a day, just opening the app and writing whatever's floating around in your head can shift something. Come back a day or two later, look at what you wrote, try to arrange it, try to connect it to something else. See if the act of looking at your own thoughts, laid out visually in front of you, tells you something that staying inside your head couldn't. Medium pause. Over time, I've started paying attention to the finer details of how I map. Not just what I write, but how I organize it. Making sure things are spelled correctly so I can search them later. Making sure an idea lived in the right category, not just wherever my hand dropped it. There's a quiet kind of self-awareness that comes with maintaining a mind map well. You start to notice the patterns, the recurring themes, the places where your thinking keeps circling back. It's one thing to know yourself. It's another to actually see yourself, laid out, branched, connected, searchable. There's something that happens when you've been mind mapping long enough. You stop just adding to it and you start reading it. And what you find isn't always what you expected to find. I remember going back through a section of my mind map I hadn't touched in about 8 months. I've been using that space to track things I was working through, friction points, you might call them, things that kept surfacing in my life that I couldn't quite resolve, patterns of avoidance, recurring tensions, questions I kept circling without landing anywhere. And when I looked at all of it together, spread across the screen in its own quiet arrangement, there was a moment of recognition that felt almost uncomfortable. The same fear had been showing up in three completely different areas of my life, wearing three completely different costumes. I had named each one separately, filed each one in a separate category, thought of each one as its own isolated problem. But looking at them together in the same visual space, the connection was unmistakable. I had been solving symptoms of the same underlying thing over and over, without ever seeing it clearly enough to address the source. That kind of pattern doesn't announce itself in a linear journal. A journal moves forward with you, one entry after the next, carried along by time. But a mind map holds things still. It doesn't let time bury what you wrote 6 months ago. Everything stays present, visible, and connected. Which means that eventually the relationships you never consciously planned for start to surface on their own. There's a term in cognitive science, externalized cognition. The idea that offloading your thoughts into a visible structure actually frees up mental bandwidth to think about them more clearly. But I think something else is also happening. When you look at your thoughts from the outside, you stop being inside the feeling and start examining it. That's a different kind of intelligence. Slower, maybe, but more honest about what's actually there. The longer I kept the practice, the less I needed the map to reveal anything new, because I was starting to catch my own patterns in real time, noticing mid-thought, I've been here before. I recognize this shape. That kind of internal recognition is quieter than insight, but it accumulates into something significant. It's not that you suddenly know what to do with your patterns once you can see them. You don't. But not seeing them at all means you're always reacting to something you don't fully understand, believing you're making fresh decisions when you're mostly just repeating a story you've been living in for years. Seeing the pattern is the beginning. It doesn't solve anything, but it changes the conversation you're able to have with yourself. There's also something worth naming about the emotional dimension of this. When you see a pattern in your mind map, really see it, not just intellectually acknowledge it, there can be a kind of grief in that recognition, the grief of realizing how long you've been circling the same thing. But underneath that is usually something more useful, relief. Because once you can see the shape of something, you're no longer inside it. You have a vantage point. And from a vantage point, even difficult things become navigable. Most of the tools we use for thinking are built in straight lines. To-do lists, bullet journals, outlines, notes apps, they all move in one direction, top to bottom, earlier to later. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Linear thinking is useful. It gets things finished. But it's also a partial map of how thinking actually works, a useful simplification that leaves a lot out. The mind doesn't move in straight lines. It jumps. It loops back on itself. It makes lateral connections between things that have no business being near each other, and sometimes those are the most interesting connections. A memory from a childhood afternoon somehow holds the key to a creative problem you've been circling for months. An anxiety about your work turns out to be the same anxiety you have about something completely unrelated in your personal life, just wearing different clothes. The most significant realizations often arrive sideways, through a door you didn't know you'd been walking toward. The structure of a mind map honors that. Branches can go in any direction. An idea can live in more than one place simultaneously. An idea can be a child of one concept and a sibling of another. There's no imposed hierarchy, no sequence demanding to be respected. You follow the logic of the thought rather than the logic of the container it happens to live in. When I try to think through something genuinely difficult using a list, I tend to stay on the surface. I write the obvious things first and then run out of momentum because lists reward completion over exploration, and once you've checked the box, the investigation ends there. But when I open a mind map and just start branching, no rules, no implied order, just following wherever one idea leads to the next, I end up somewhere I wouldn't have predicted. Somewhere the list would never have taken me, because the list didn't have permission to go there. There's a reasonable argument that the format of a tool shapes the quality of the thinking that happens inside it. That a mind map doesn't just hold your thoughts differently, it invites a different kind of thought to begin with. That freedom from sequence creates permission to connect things that would have stayed strangers inside a numbered column. Maybe it's spatial freedom. Maybe it's the absence of implied priority. Maybe it's simply that seeing ideas arranged across a plane rather than stacked vertically makes the relationships between them easier to notice. Whatever the mechanism, something loosens when the page has no top or bottom. Thinking stops feeling like filling in blanks. It starts feeling more like exploration. That might be worth considering the next time you're staring at a blank page and nothing is coming. The problem might not be what you're thinking about. It might be the shape of the container you're trying to think inside. There's also a practical dimension to this that I didn't anticipate when I started. When I use a list to plan something, I end up with a plan. When I use a mind map to think through the same thing, I often end up with a question I didn't know I needed to ask, something that would have stayed invisible inside the linear structure.
The branch goes somewhere unexpected, and that unexpected place turns out to be more important than the destination I was originally heading toward. That's not inefficiency. That's the thing.
At some point, a mind map stops being a tool and starts being something else. Something more like a record, a living one. I have entries in my mind map from years ago, thoughts I put down when I was in a completely different place, working through things I've long since moved past, or chasing ideas that didn't develop the way I imagined. Some of it reads like a stranger wrote it. Some of it reads like it was written last week. And I've kept all of it, not as a monument to who I used to be, but because revisiting it tells me something I genuinely can't get any other way. Memory is a notoriously unreliable narrator. We edit our own histories without fully realizing we're doing it, smoothing the complicated parts, revising the emotional texture of things we actually lived through. Sometimes we remember being more lost than we were, sometimes more certain. The original emotional truth of a moment almost never survives the passage of time intact. We compress things. We allow what happened later to quietly recolor what came before. But a mind map doesn't do any of that. It keeps the original draft, exactly as it was, in whatever state I was in when I wrote it. The uncertainty, the half-formed ideas, the questions that didn't yet have a direction. And reading it now, years later, is sometimes disorienting, and sometimes clarifying in a way that nothing else quite replicates. I can trace the evolution of an idea from its earliest, most uncertain version to wherever it eventually landed. I can identify the moment a belief started shifting, not through the filter of memory, but in the actual words I chose on the actual day something began to move me. I can find thoughts I'd completely forgotten I'd ever had, and recognize them as something I still carry, just wearing a different form now. Most digital tools are optimized for the present. They help you manage now, act on now, capture now. A mind map that you genuinely maintain over years becomes something different. It becomes a document of your own development, not the version of yourself you perform for the outside world, but the version that actually did the thinking before any of it was ready to be seen. There's real value in having access to that version. It keeps you honest about how far you've actually come, and honest about how much of your history you've been rewriting without realizing it. That version deserves somewhere to live. I've also found something unexpected in revisiting very old entries. The awareness of how much I've changed, not in the ways I thought I would, but in ways I never specifically intended. You don't see that kind of growth in real time. You have to step back far enough to see the arc. And a mind map, maintained honestly over years, gives you a timeline of your own interior life that memory alone can't replicate. Not because memory is dishonest, but because it's selective. The map keeps what memory lets go of. I want to be careful about something here. Mind mapping is usually framed as a productivity tool, a way to organize projects, structure meetings, brainstorm deliverables. And it works well for all of those things. But that framing misses something important about what it can actually become over time. What I found over years of using it, not just as a task manager, but as a space for genuine reflection, is that a mind map, when you really let it, becomes less like a tool and more like a mirror. Not the kind that flatters, the kind that just shows you what's actually there. There's a real difference between thinking and seeing what you think. When a thought stays inside your head, it tends to feel more solid than it actually is. Opinions present as facts. Anxieties dress up as certainties. Hopes feel too fragile to examine closely, so you leave them half-formed somewhere quiet where they can't be disappointed. The interior life has a way of becoming self-sealing. Thoughts that confirm other thoughts. Loops that close before they can be questioned. But when you take that same thought and drop it into a node on a screen, something shifts. It becomes an object, something external to you, something you can look at from the outside, place in a different branch, surround it with related ideas, hold it up next to a contradictory thought and see what happens. The minor formality of typing it out, of placing it somewhere in a structure, that tiny bit of distance is enough to change your relationship to it. I've changed my mind about things by mind mapping them.
Not through formal reasoning, but because making a thought visible revealed something about it that I couldn't see while it was still just living inside my head. A conviction I'd been carrying for years turned out to be something I'd never actually examined. An anxiety I'd been managing turned out to be protecting a belief I didn't even know I held. It's a little like what happens when you say something out loud that you've only been thinking quietly, and hearing your own voice say it makes you realize it doesn't hold up the way it felt like it did inside, or that it actually holds up better. Either way, something becomes clearer. The thought arrives in better focus once it's outside of you. The map reflects back more than you consciously put into it, and occasionally what it shows you is worth sitting with for a long time before you decide what to do with. I've started thinking of it this way. The mind map doesn't tell me what to think. It shows me what I've been thinking, which is a different service entirely, and in some ways a more valuable one. Because most of us are not suffering from a shortage of opinions or ideas or beliefs. We're suffering from insufficient distance from them. We need space to look at what we actually carry rather than just carrying it. And sometimes all it takes is the small act of writing it down and stepping back an inch. Now, I don't want to pretend paper didn't have something. It did. There was a particular kind of presence that came with sitting down with a pen and a blank page. A slowness that felt almost ceremonial. No notifications pulling at your attention, no other tabs, no blinking cursor implying you should already know what comes next. Just ink and thought and the sound of the pen moving. I understand why people are devoted to that. I was devoted to it. And that devotion was earned by something real. The physical act of handwriting is cognitively different from typing. Research suggests it encodes information more deeply, in part because it forces selection. You can't transcribe everything, so you're constantly making choices about what matters. There's an intimacy to the pen that the keyboard doesn't replicate. And the filled journal sitting on a shelf carries its own kind of weight. Something tangible. Something that says in the most basic possible way that you were here and you were thinking about your life. But I kept running into the same wall. I'd write something meaningful on a Tuesday, and the month later it was buried under 20 other pages with no way back in. No search, no connection to anything else. An idea that deserved to develop just sat there, stranded on a page, alone and unlinked. The analog to digital shift in journaling isn't really about efficiency, or at least it shouldn't be framed that way. It's about what you sacrifice in the translation and what you gain in return. You lose the tactile, you lose the forced slowness, which has genuine value. You lose handwriting as its own mode of expression, the pressure, the slope, the way urgency looks different from calm on paper, the way the hand sometimes knows something before the mind catches up. But you gain the ability to find things, to connect an idea from 3 years ago to a realization from last month without having to remember which journal held it. You gain a structure that can actually be built upon, that can grow in all directions, that doesn't stop being useful the moment the notebook fills up. The format matters less than the practice in the end. Paper or digital, the question that determines everything is whether you're actually returning to what you wrote and whether you're letting it become something beyond the moment you wrote it. A full journal that never gets reopened is just a very sincere drawer. I keep a physical notebook for some things still. Mornings mostly. Something about beginning the day with pen and paper has a different quality than beginning it with a screen. But I no longer see the two as competing. They're doing different work. The notebook captures the day as it's happening. The mind map holds the longer arc, the threads that persist across days and weeks, the things that need time and space to develop. Together, they cover more ground than either could alone. At some point, I started noticing something beyond the content of what I'd written. The map itself, the structure of it, was telling me something. Organization is never neutral. The categories we reach for instinctively, the labels we choose, the connections we make, and the ones we never think to make, all of it encodes assumptions about how we sort the world. Most of those assumptions are invisible because they feel like common sense. They're not decisions we made, they're just the shape our thinking defaulted to. A mind map maintained long enough starts to surface those defaults, and sometimes what it surfaces is worth examining. I noticed after years of mapping that almost every idea I had about creative work was filed inside branches organized by project name. Everything linked to a deliverable, a specific outcome I was trying to produce. Buried inside that structure was an assumption I had been operating from without questioning, that creativity was a means to an end, not a territory worth exploring on its own. Moving those ideas into their own branch, separating creative thinking from project execution, changed something, not just in the map, in how I actually approach the work. The reorganization was also a reorientation. What you call something affects how you treat it. What category you put something in determines what questions you're willing to ask about it. The small details matter more here than you'd expect. Making sure entries are spelled consistently, not for aesthetics, but because a keyword search needs to find every instance. Making sure a thought actually lands in the right branch rather than wherever your hand dropped it in a hurried moment, because a misplaced thought is almost as lost as an unwritten one. The discipline of maintaining a map carefully, of occasionally going back through it and asking whether things still belong where they are, that becomes over time a form of mental precision, a practice of asking, is this really what I think this is? There's a distinct feeling from looking at a well-maintained mind map and recognizing yourself in it. Not just seeing what you've been thinking about, but seeing how you think, the shape of your attention, the hierarchies you actually live by as opposed to the ones you tell yourself you hold. A collection of thoughts and a navigable structure are very different things. One is a pile. The other is something you can understand, build on, and come back to. I've also noticed that the process of reorganizing, going back through old branches and asking whether things still belong where they are, functions as its own kind of reflection. You revisit what you wrote, you assess it, you move things, rename things, sometimes delete things you no longer believe, and that maintenance work isn't busy work. It's a form of thinking that the act of writing alone doesn't give you. You're not just adding to the map, you're editing yourself. And that's a practice worth having. How many ideas have you had in the shower? On the drive home with the radial turned low? Right at the edge of sleep, in that soft, permeable space where the grip on the day relaxes and something unexpected comes through? Most of them disappear, not because they weren't worth keeping, some were probably significant, but because the gap between having a thought and recording it is just wide enough for most of them to fall through. No friction, no trace, gone before you fully registered them. There's something genuinely strange about that when you sit with it. The volume of thinking that moves through us every single day and leaves no record at all. Observations, connections, quiet questions, realizations about our own patterns, all of it flowing through and washing out. And most of us aren't particularly bothered by it because you can't miss what you don't remember losing. But some of what disappears deserve to stay. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not every passing thought, most of them don't need saving, but some of them do. And the difficulty is that you rarely know which ones at the time. The idea that feels too obvious to bother writing down might be the one that would have changed the direction of something, if it had survived long enough to be revisited. The half-formed hunch at midnight might be the beginning of something you'd have spent months trying to find your way back to. The habit of capture changes you in subtle ways that compound over time, not just because you hold on to more, but because when you know you're going to write something down, you start paying closer attention to what you're thinking in the first place. The act of recording and the act of noticing start to reinforce each other. Attention follows the practice. You become someone who catches more simply because you've built a container worth catching things into. A mind map becomes, among other things, a place for what would otherwise slip away. And over time, having that place, knowing it exists, knowing you'll return to it, changes the texture of daily experience. Things that would have passed unnoticed start to feel worth capturing. The world becomes a little more worth paying attention to because you've made a habit of believing that what you notice might matter. Most of what disappeared was always going to disappear, but some of it deserved a branch. I've started treating the moment of wanting to capture something as a small act of respect for the thought itself and for the version of myself who might need it later. Not everything I write down turns into anything. Most of it just sits in a branch and waits. But occasionally I return to something I almost didn't write down, and it becomes the exact thing I needed. The gap between those two outcomes is just a few seconds of friction. Usually, it's worth closing. Everything we've been moving through, the patterns hiding in plain sight, the difference between a branch and a line, the archive that holds the original draft of your thinking, the mirror that shows you what you actually believe, the analog versus digital question, the way structure reveals your assumptions, the thoughts that disappear before you can hold them. All of it keeps pointing back to something that sounds simpler than it is: the practice of returning to yourself. Not the version of yourself that shows up polished and ready to be understood, the quieter one, the one working through things in the background, forming conclusions you haven't consciously arrived at yet, carrying questions that still don't have names, moving slowly towards something that hasn't found its language yet. A mind map at its best is a place where that version of you gets to exist visibly, not performed for anyone else, not optimized or compressed into something shareable, just present, mapped, branched, organized into something you can actually look at and say, here is what I've been carrying. Here is what actually matters to me when no one is watching. Here is where I am still working things out, and here is where something finally clicked, and here is where I changed my mind about something I thought I'd already settled. The longer you keep the practice, the more it becomes something beyond a tool or a record. It becomes evidence. Evidence that you were here, paying attention, that the ideas you had in an earlier chapter actually led somewhere real, that the fears you were willing to name eventually loosened their grip, or at least became more honest about what they actually were, that the version of you who first opened the app and typed a single uncertain thought is connected in a traceable line to whoever's sitting with the map now. There's no finished version of a mind map. It grows as you grow. It accommodates contradiction, revision, branches that go nowhere, and branches that open without warning into something you didn't expect. It holds your certainties lightly and leaves room for the parts of yourself you're still figuring out. It doesn't demand that you be done. Which is, when you think about it, a fairly honest picture of what it actually feels like to be a person working on becoming one. Not performing growth, not following a program, but genuinely in the middle of something that doesn't have a clear ending. So here's what I keep wondering, and maybe you've asked yourself something close to this too. If you could step outside your mind for a moment and see everything you've actually been thinking and feeling and hoping for and quietly avoiding laid out like a map of somewhere you've been living without quite realizing it, what would you find there that you didn't already know you knew?